does it take to reload precision ammo? It takes consistency and a lot of patience. In today's episode of Cummings Gun Works, the anatomy of a pew. Shooters ready? Stand by! Alright, before we get into my process for reloading for my precision rifle, I think it'd be wise to take a moment to give just a quick primer on the anatomy of a pew. What actually goes into and makes up the components of a modern cartridge. So we'll go through this one at a time real quick. First off, we have the primer. The primer is this little piece right here. Let me get that a little closer for you. The primer goes into the back of the case. You can see it has little leaves in it pointing inwards. Those are called the anvil. The way that it works is when the firing pin or striker of the firearm hits the back of the primer, it crushes it in against the anvil. Wedged in between the two is a chemical compound. Can't exactly recall at this moment what it is made up of, but the point is when it gets crushed, it ignites and creates flame. So, the primer, we have an anvil, and it makes fire. We have the case. Ta-da! This is a case for my 6.5 Creedmoor. This is a piece of Hornady brass, once fired. You can see that little pocket there in the back, that's the primer pocket. You can see that little hole in the center. That is called the flash hole. That is where the fire from the primer goes through the back and enters the body of the case to ignite the powder. I should also note, the primer creates pressure. The primer creates pressure in and of itself. There's, who makes it? Aguila makes the cartridge in .22 long rifle called the Super Calibri, which to my understanding has no powder in it whatsoever. It's a small little 20 grain projectile about the size of an air gun pellet, and it is propelled down the barrel of your firearm using nothing but the pressure created from the primer. So, fun fact: when you get into internal ballistics, this becomes a bit more important. The pressure created from the primer being struck has an effect on the initial trajectory of your projectile inside the chamber of your rifle. In some cases, if it's strong enough and you don't have enough of a tight enough hold on the projectile, it depends on how you've reloaded it. Right, it's not necessarily a problem. But there, in some cases, that primer strike will be enough to push the projectile out of the case and start it into the rifling before the powder even really gets a chance to get going. Now, mind you, all this takes place, in increments of thousandths of a second. So, just food for thought. It creates pressure. So we have a case, right? The case has a primer pocket. Please excuse the traffic outside. It has a flash hole. This portion up here, where it begins to taper, is called the shoulder. And this portion up here at the front that actually grips the projectile is called the neck. Okay? That is the cartridge case. Also, when you're looking at cartridge cases, the writing at the top here is called the head stamp. Just, a bit of trivia for you. It generally denotes the calibers and can sometimes denote the manufacturer. Next, we have the projectile. This is the thing that actually gets flung when you squeeze the trigger. The projectile has a couple of parts. This one is a Hornady 143 grain ELDX. Okay? There's a mathematical way to describe the curve between the straight area of the projectile here, the bearing surface, which bites into the rifling of your barrel, and how it transitions into the point. That description is called an ogive. This one is a boat tail. You can see how it tapers towards the end. There's also flat bases. Go ahead and write that down. The bullet weight is going to play a large, important factor into how much powder you load into your case, because, you know, the mass imparts resistance, right? It has momentum, has resting momentum. And when you start to create pressure behind it, the amount of momentum that it has to be overcome. If you have too little powder or too much powder, it can be problematic, right? So the weight of your projectile and the burn rate of your powder are going to come into play. I think that is about all the basics you really need to know. This one is a, like I said, it's an ELDM, so extreme low drag match. There's a whole science around, you know, quote, extreme low drag projectiles. It all has to do with the ballistic coefficient. Check out my blog. I've done a more in-depth write-up on ballistic coefficient and what it means, how it's calculated, the different models that they use today, what the standards are. It's really in-depth. I find it very fascinating, but it's a little more in the weeds than we're going to get into for the sake of this video. Okay? And the last part of your pew is the powder. Cut. Okay, so I was going back through it, and I realized I got way too in the weeds on the powder thing. Alright, so we're just going to roll that back a little bit and try this again. We have powder. Pew! First thing you need to know about modern powder, it is smokeless. This means that unlike black powder, it does not detonate, it deflagrates. It has a much slower burn rate than black powder. It doesn't explode, it burns and builds pressure. The fact that the powder charge is contained inside the rifle and inside the chamber, that containment is what gives it its oomph, right? So it burns more slowly, and it's a slower buildup. There is a curve, right, where you've got pressure and you've got time, and the pressure builds up as such till it reaches its peak, and then it comes back down like so until at some point over here arbitrarily your projectile exits the muzzle of your gun. Okay? What else do you need to know? Let me grab something off the shelf. This is a 1 pound jar of Alliant RL-17. This is a very common modern smokeless rifle powder. This one uses extruded pellets. There are a number of different designs for the shape of the granules of modern smokeless powders. Extruded pellets are, I think, the most common. There's a couple of other shapes or designs you can go with. Some say they have more consistent burns, or they're more temperature stable. That's a whole other rabbit hole you can go down yourself when you start choosing what powder you want to drop. But for the sake of this video, what you need to know is that this pressure curve is important and that modern powder is smokeless. So why is this pressure curve important? When you have your projectile loaded into your case, sitting in the chamber of your rifle, right, so let's just draw that up real quick. We'll assume this is to scale of some kind, right? You've got the neck of your case, and you've got your projectile blip, 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 seated down in here, and it comes out the end as such, right? And that's sitting inside the chamber in your rifle, and the barrel comes out down this way. Right? So the amount of powder you have in here is called your charge weight. And the overall length of your cartridge will determine your seating depth, right? There's a couple of different ways to measure it. You can go cartridge base to ogive, which most people agree is a more accurate way of reading the seating depth or the overall length of your projectile. And ogive, as we mentioned before, is a measurement that describes the shape of the projectile. In this case, what you're measuring is the cartridge base to the area on the projectile that's actually going to bite into the lands of the rifle. Okay. Then you have COL, C-O-L, or C-O-A-L, and that stands for cartridge overall length, which will be a measurement from the cartridge base to the tip of the projectile. Okay, and both these measurements give you different important numbers, right, for various reasons. Overall length is more important for how well is it going to work in my magazine, if I'm using a magazine fed, particularly for semi-automatic rifles. And cartridge base to ogive is more accurate, determining how far is the jump, the freeboard jump, between where your projectile sits and the lands. Okay? Where this all ties into your powder. Be sure when you go to select your powder, you look at the manufacturer's website or reloading manuals. And when you're first starting off, make sure you observe the maximum charge weight and the minimum overall length. And the reason that's important, if you have the maximum charge weight inside the combustion chamber, inside the cartridge you're loading, and you go below the minimum overall length, meaning that you push this projectile further into the case than the manufacturer tells you to, what you're doing is you are restricting the volume of that initial combustion chamber. And like Boyle's law, when you decrease the volume, you increase the pressure, right? So just be wary of that. That's why all of this matters, okay? It's just a PSA. Make sure you follow manufacturer guidelines. Of course, reloading gives you the ability to play around and push some boundaries, but when you're starting out, be sure you don't exceed those. And yeah, and that's powder. All right, good, done. All right, so here I've got a little bit of RL-17 poured out in this dish, and this is just to demonstrate, the burn rate of smokeless rifle powders. Remember that the pressure that is behind your bullet, what makes it move so fast, it's not an explosion, right? It's not a sudden release of energy. It's the buildup, the continuous buildup of pressure inside the chamber of your rifle and down the barrel, right? So it's a slow build. So here we go, real quick. See that? No big explosion. And that's what's happening inside your chamber. So when you take that and you contain it inside the chamber, inside the barrel, inside the gun, and you force it into a real small space, that burn is going to create a lot more pressure than what you see here. And that's where you get the power from. It's the buildup of the pressure, not the powder exploding. So I've got some cleaned brass here. First step in reloading is to clean your brass. I personally use an ultrasonic cleaner. Some guys like to use the physical media tumblers to clean them up. Whatever is your preference. Step 1, clean it. Step 2 is going to be to trim the case neck down to a given length. Manufacturer and reloading information says that a trimmed case length for 6.5 Creedmoor is supposed to be 1.910 inches. And the reason... So there's a couple reasons for that, right? So if your case neck is too long, then you could have some issues where it stretches and starts touching the lands. Not likely, but it changes the pressure in your chamber, right? Secondly, if you trim all your case necks back to the exact same length, then you have more consistent bearing surface with projectile when it's seated. Okay. If you've got more material on here gripping the projectile, obviously that's going to change the amount of friction and the amount of force it's going to take to overcome it and introduce inconsistencies between one shot and the next. So part of the explanation for why this process is necessary. You lock it into a trimmer. We'll trim it down. Excuse the noise. Sorry. All right. So, trim down. I could feel the resistance stop. I've got this set exactly where I want it. So now we have a trimmed case. The trimming process is going to leave a rough edge both inside and out on the case neck. So we're going to take a simple deburring tool and we're going to clean that up. All right. Yeah, nice and clean. The next step is going to be resizing the case neck so that it grips the projectile properly and punching out the primer, and that's going to happen in one step on the press. Okay, so here I've got my press. I've got my, so I'm using the Lee Precision reloading dies for 6.5 Creedmoor. It's got a neck sizing die in it currently. You can resize your cases in two ways. You can neck size them, or you can full length size them. What full length sizing does, the purpose of it really is to make the ammunition more consistent and reliable for auto guns, so your gas guns, anything semi-automatic, those things that would be a bit more, if the case is too tight moving into the chamber for a semi-automatic, there's a potential that you can have some reliability problems, right? That's what full length sizing overcomes. If you're going to be firing the brass in the exact same gun that you fired it in the first time, you neck size it, because the brass has been fire formed already to the chamber of your gun. It is, theoretically, it's exactly in tolerance where it needs to be. It's going to rest in the chamber very consistently. So I fire this cartridge in my Bergara. I'm going to fire it again in my Bergara. And so that I get more consistency out of it, I'm going to neck size it. All that's going to do is change the diameter of the neck and not affect the diameter of the body of the rest of the case. So we're going to open up a press here, stick it in, push it up. So I just felt it stop right there. The next thing that's going to happen is the primer is going to get pushed out, like that. I'm going to apply pressure to it to force the case into the resizing collet. Pull it out, give it a little turn, do it again, just like that. All right, so I've got my deprimed and resized brass. The next thing I'm going to do is take a flash hole reamer, this one's from Lyman, and resize the flash hole, or ream it out. The point of this is a lot of times there's inconsistencies introduced in the flash holes. It's actually been surprising to me to see how much difference there is between one case and the next, between how much material comes out. This one wasn't too bad. What that does is make sure that the flash hole between all of your reloads is of a uniform size, so you don't have any abnormalities, any burrs, or anything of that nature inside there that could introduce any significant rates of burn changes or basically any inconsistencies. Next thing to do is clean out the primer pocket. For that, I'm just using a screwdriver. They have tools they make for this, but this works just fine. Just clean all the mung out of there. Just like that. The next step probably isn't necessary, but I like to go ahead and clean out the case neck with a brush just to make sure there's no brass shavings or anything of that nature stuck in there, any trash from the previous processes. And that is that. Now we're ready to go ahead and drop a primer in it. I'm going to take one of my Federal Ammunition large rifle primers. Take one of these out. Normally I would do these in batches, but for the sake of this video, I'm just going to take one. I'm going to, you can see on the press here, there's a little arm, right? This arm rides inside the main shaft here. Then it's got a little cup on the top. This cup is spring-loaded, and on the inside it's got a little driver. And that driver is what's going to be used to push the primer into the back of the case. So I'm going to insert the primer into the cup. There's different ways to drop primers. I like to do it on the press, but they have tools for it. There's like 3 or 4 different ways people like to do it. This is just what I'm using for now. So I got my primer in there, take my case, drop it on, and I feel contact, give it a little push, like so. Make sure the primer is nice and flush, and it is. We're good to go. So now the next step is going to be weighing out and dropping powder charges and seating projectiles. I'll go ahead and stick that over here with the rest of my ready brass. I've got 2 more to make for this reload session, and then we'll get into the next step. All right, so here we are trucking along with our reloading. I've got all of the casings that I've prepared. Double checked all of them for length and the rims and everything. Made sure quality control is up to snuff. Got them all grouped up. The next thing I did, which may be a little overkill, is I went through all my projectiles. I'm loading Hornady 143 grain ELDX projectiles. I went through all my projectiles, weighed them out, and when I go through and drop powder and load them in, I try to do them in my 5-shot strings. I'll group them by bullet weights that are within 1/10 of a grain of each other, because there is some variance in the weights from the factory. So, like I said, it might be overkill, but it's part of my process. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start dropping powder. So I've got my powder measurer, I've got a trickler, and we're going to kind of step through this piece by piece and show you that process. So you can see here I've got the RL16 sitting behind the powder dropper. I'm going to take the little plate that comes with the scale. I'm just using the standard RCBS balance beam scale. I would like to upgrade to a digital scale or maybe one of the automated dispensing systems moving forward, but this is what we got for now, and it'll work just fine. I've got the charge weight set to just below my desired weight. So I'm going to go ahead, make sure when you do this, you take the plate and you stick it up against the bottom of the dropper, because if you hold it down here and the powder comes spilling out, it's going to fly everywhere. Ask me how I know. So we stick it up there, we drop that and load it into the chamber, and we pour it out into our plate as such. Then we're going to take it over to our scale. Alright, so I've got the powder on the scale. The scale was obviously tailored to the weight of the plate prior to this process. And I've got the desired grain weight set out. Now I've got a powder trickler that I'm going to use to slowly bring the overall charge weight up to exactly where I want it. This is a much more precise process than just going off of what your dropper is putting out. I'm going to give this a turn. You can see there's some powder trickling out. Wait for the scale to come up. Almost there. Slowly. A little more. Right there. Alright, so now I have the exact charge weight that I want to drop into this particular load. Alright, so I've got my plate with my powder, exact charge weight I'm looking for. Take one of my cases that I've so caringly uniformed, stick it on my plate, take a funnel, and drop the powder charge just like that. Alright, we'll do that 4 more times, and then we'll drop the projectiles for this string. Alright, so I've got powder dropped in all of my cases. I've got the projectiles picked out that I want to be using. So on here, I've got my bullet seating die on the press, and I've backed the seating screw out a little bit just to make sure I've got some landing strip, right? So when you start loading your own projectiles for the first time, you want to back this out a ways, and then follow this process I'm about to show you, wherein you take your case, you set it into the press, take your projectile, set it in the case, and load it in. As such. Then you take your calipers, and measure here the overall length. Yeah, maybe you can, maybe you can't. I'm getting an overall length on this cartridge of 2.868. My overall length that I'm shooting for my use case is 2.855. That is the maximum length I find that works reliably in the magazine on my rifle. So that's what I'll be loading for. So now what I will do is I'll take the screw here, I will turn it in ever so slightly and incrementally press the bullet further in until I get a reading that is where I want it to be. And then I will repeat that process for the remaining cartridges in this string. .855. All right. Call that one good. Get the rest of these. What I did with this string was I went through them and went ahead and seated all of the projectiles at the original setting that I had for the die, and then checked all of them for uniformity. The reason I do that is I have found in my personal experience that sometimes these projectiles, based on the way that they're shaped or some irregularity, will not always seat to the same depth. However, if I drop them all at once, I can measure them all at once at a longer seating depth and make sure that they're all seating uniformly prior to setting the depth and pushing them all in. That way I don't make some that are too short, because you can make them too long and make them shorter, but if you make them too short, you can't make them any longer, right? Or you can, but it's a real pain. So for example, this one is coming out at 2.857. It needs a couple more thousandths to get down to the proper size. Make sure everything's uniform. Consistency is king. Double and triple check. Alright, so now we have 5 cartridges loaded to the exact same length with the exact same powder charge, which have uniform cases. So I will take this string, load it into my box with all the others. Now we are ready to take those out to the field for testing. I will finish dropping all the strings I'm going to test today, and then I guess you'll see me at the range. We'll take it and hit some paper. Alright guys, so here you can see that the best group of the day was 9/16 of an inch, or about 0.55 inches. So we're hovering just at half-minute group, which is a fantastic result. I've read a lot of stuff online where people have had issues getting really good accuracy out of the Hornady 143 grain ELDX projectiles. But this is, that's perfectly adequate for my applications. Next step for me is going to be taking this charge weight and playing around with seating depth. The Booger company has put out a really interesting article on seating depth. for projectiles, the extreme low drag projectiles, which have the secant ogive. An interesting thing to note is that typically when you're looking at the difference between secant and tangent ogives, the secant ogive is more likely to have issues with free bore jump than a tangent ogive is. But a tangent ogive is not as aerodynamic as a secant. So Booger has done a lot of research on this subject, and I'll leave a link to a couple articles in the description of this video that are very interesting. But I came across one recently which actually details some of the research that they've done with secant ogive projectiles and freeboard jump, and they discovered that there's a sweet spot of jump that you can arrive at that will give you optimal results. So I'm going to be taking that article, I'm going to be playing around with some seating depth for these projectiles and hitting the range again and seeing if I can't make this group any smaller. Alright, so what else do you need to know about precision reloading? Notes. Keep meticulous notes. I've got a notebook where I record all my range sessions. I keep round count logs to keep track of my barrel life. I keep track of weather conditions, group sizes, all the loads that I'm testing. I got them all in here, all the numbers. I've drawn in some graphs, just keeping track of everything, making sure that you have meticulous notes that you can reference at a later date. Data is important. That's what the whole precision thing is about, right? It's all about data. I've got stacks of targets that I've held on to, and I've labeled all the targets. I've got, what kind of brass I'm using. Excuse me. All the data on the particular cartridges I was loading. I've got references here so I can see what kind of groups that I'm printing out, what the weather was like. All these things I hold on to. Tracking, keeping notes, making sure that you've got a handle on exactly what's going on so that you know exactly what needs to be tuned to get the maximum performance that you're looking for. And I think that's about all I've got. Remember that this is a primer on the subject. Oh my gosh, precision reloading in particular is a deep, deep rabbit hole to go down. Every aspect of it, from the cases you use, the primers, the powder, the projectiles, the seating depth, the temperature, everything, right? Everything comes into play when you're looking at making extreme long-range shots, and there's no lack of information to be found on any one of these sub-subjects on the internet. So if something you're interested in, please, by all means, hit Wikipedia, hit YouTube, hit Booger, Hornady. A lot of these companies that manufacture these components put out a lot of research, which is interesting to read. And just get out there and learn. I'm learning every day. Learn and have fun with it. And thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, remember, not only your target, but what's beyond it. Thanks, y'all. Oh, so I did want to make just one more quick note while I'm thinking about it. Haven't done any chronograph work with these loads yet. So more numbers that are going to become really important when you get into precision reloading is going to be your extreme spread and standard deviation and your velocity. Your velocity is going to be used to calculate your trajectories, right, in conjunction with your ballistic coefficient. And your extreme spread and standard deviation are indicators of how consistent your velocities are going to be, right? You want those numbers to be pretty small. That way you know that you've got very repeatable results, especially when you start stretching out long range. But I should be getting a chronograph in pretty soon, and we can start testing that, and that's going to be a lot of fun. More numbers, guys. Anyway, thanks.